Grab a cup of tea or listen as you go, ladies. This is your hour with Dr. Zoe, your life and relationship coach. With encouragement, on-point insight, inspiring guests, health tips, and advice, Dr. Zoe helps busy women keep their mind in the game by redefining your Superwoman. You're listening to The Dr. Zoe Show.
Welcome to The Dr. Zoe Show, redefining your Superwoman. I'm your host, Dr. Zoe. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with a doctorate in clinical psychology. I'm a life and relationship coach and a motivational speaker, and I can work with you virtually to help you get unstuck. My passion is helping women find their superpower, learn to embrace it, and share it with the world. Please connect with me by texting the word JOIN to 38470 or go to my website at drzoeshaw.com. I love it when I hear from other women. And actually, before I get started, I'm going to get a shout out to some women. The first is Sarah. Sarah gave some feedback, a review, and she said, "Thank you so much for this podcast. This is a great one. I hate that I can't talk to other women about being strong without other women bashing men and putting them all in one category." I'm so glad you said that because that's what this is all about. We need to honor our own strength and honor the strength of our men. So I'm glad that you are getting that from this podcast, and thanks for listening. I wanted to give another shout out to Beautypreneurs. They are an organization on Instagram. They have great content about being the best in your industry and slaying your goals. So if you're in Charlotte, North Carolina, check them out. They're called Beautypreneur, and they're actually having a brunch on April 14th. There might be still time for you to get in on that. I will put the link to their Instagram account on here. So I'm not perfect. Yeah, I just said that. I just needed to blurt that out. But I just wanted to make sure everybody knows that I am not perfect. And I'm so excited to have Melissa Maimone on the show today. We are going to be talking about the gifts of your dark place. And I say that because I think it's so important for us to talk about our vulnerabilities, to talk about the realness of our humanity. And that's why I share my Superwoman win and my Superwoman fail, because we also have those wins. So my fail today is that I feel like I've just been too critical of my kids all week. It's kind of like a dawning realization for me. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one, but it all comes from a good place, right? Because I'm looking at my kids. I'm like, okay, did you get this done? Did you take care of this? How's your grade in math? And make sure you iron that shirt, and just everything about stuff that has to be done, what they look like, what they're doing and taking care of and performing. I was listening to this podcast and I heard this years and years ago, and it really stuck with me. Apparently not long enough, as most things don't. It was Toni Morrison's parenting advice. Her advice was, let your face light up when they enter the room, when you're kids, that your kids should see that your face lights up when they enter the room. And it kind of hit me because I thought, I don't know if that's going on with me right now. I feel like sometimes, when my kids enter the room, I'm scanning them up and down, making sure they're presentable, thinking about something that needs to be taken care of. So that was my little aha moment that, okay, I'm being a little too critical. I need to focus back on just who they are, loving these beings just for who they are. So my win, we do swing that mom pendulum sometimes, and that's just a reality of life. I always talk about how balance is somewhere in the middle. But yesterday was my daughter's 13th birthday, Sullivan, and we went to the American Girl doll store. Sullivan still very much loves her dolls. You guys who listen often know that she has special needs. And so the cool part of that she has praderwilli syndrome, is that she's still very slow to mature. So I've got a 13-year-old girl who, looks like she's a woman in this body, but she loves her dolls. And so we went to the American Girl doll store in Los Angeles, which is, if any of you guys have been there, crazy. We had a reservation for tea and lunch upstairs, which was wonderful. We had such a good time. We made appointments for her dolls to get their hair done at the salon. Both of her dolls got their hair done, and we just girled it out at American Girl doll store. We had just Sully and my other daughter, Siggy. The three of us had a girls' day, and it was just so precious. So that's a mom win. That's just a family win. We just had a great time. And on to the topic, the gifts of your dark place. I'm so excited about this because My guest is Melissa Maimone. She's been on twice. We're going to talk about that already. But I endorsed her book, The Radiant Midnight, and I believe this is only my second book endorsement, and I certainly wouldn't endorse something that I don't really believe in. But this spoke to my heart, and I hope that you get her book and that it speaks to yours as well. Listen in. Melissa, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so excited. I talked about you on the podcast last week. You are, I think, only my second time guest, and I'm so happy to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And that feels like a big honor. So thank you for having me back. And I've been very much looking forward to our conversation today because I just think we're kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And I have a feeling that we could probably have a podcast that would be 5 hours and just talk and talk. But I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you so much for having me back.
You are so welcome. And I was thinking the same thing. I'm thinking, okay, I have to keep it focused because there's a ton of stuff that I want to talk about, but I'm trying to keep it focused. And for you listeners, Melissa was a really early guest of mine. It was September 18th, 2017, and we were talking about her book, Gathering Dandelions. I encourage you to go back to that episode because I don't want to go over a lot of the stuff that we talked then, and she gives a good history. So I encourage you to go back to that episode. The audio might not be that great because we were doing it at the radio station and I podcasted that myself, but the info is there. And yeah, I've only had one other second guest. And so it's because I so admire you and I've talked about you before. And I think we're kindred spirits too. But today we are going to be talking about your new book that's coming out April 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, I think, such a great sister to Gathering Dandelions, and we will talk about it, but the title of it is Radiant Midnight, Depression, Grace, and the Gifts of a Dark Place. And so the topic today is the gifts of your dark place, and I really want to talk to women. Well, I'm going to talk after you do your Superwoman win and Superwoman fail because I want to talk about that dark place. So first, can you share with my audience your Superwoman win and your Superwoman fail?
Absolutely. Gosh, there's a myriad of things to choose from in terms of the Superwoman fail. So my mind goes in about 17 different directions. But one that happened actually just recently, and I ended up posting about it on my Instagram, was I was speaking at a retreat last weekend. And before the next session started, I had to speak about 3 or 4 different times over the course of the weekend. I went to go into the bathroom to use the restroom, and I came out of the stall and was washing my hands, and a woman came running in, sort of wild-eyed and frantic. And she said, "Melissa, I think your microphone is on." And sure enough, it was, because it was attached to me, but it was taped to my face and everything. So I'm not really paying attention to the button because it's already, sort of fastened to me.
Well, they do that stuff, right?
Yes. And so apparently the room where I was speaking got to hear me in the lavatory.
Gosh.
Praise the Lord. It wasn't anything complicated. And there was chatter. So some women did not hear it and others did. But that was a Superwoman fail for sure. Like, it's speaking 101, like, make sure your mic is off when you use the restroom. And hey, I didn't think about that when I went to the restroom.
You didn't. And it's like the horror. I'm sure all the women listening right now are going, oh my gosh, how embarrassing. And of course, I read that on your Instagram and I responded, thank you for the laugh, because it's like, what else can you do but laugh, right?
Or cry. But, I think it was a good litmus test for me because I've been doing speaking for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I can do it and I'm comfortable doing it, and I believe it's within my gifting and my calling, it doesn't mean that I don't have deep insecurities about it either.
Yes.
Or, worry that what I'm communicating is what I'm actually wanting to communicate, or that I'm clear with people. And so I think it sort of dovetails right into the Superwoman win, which was, she said that and I laughed, and then I thought about it some more and I thought, you know what, I'm going to post this on Instagram because I want people to laugh with me. And I also want them to see that, gosh, we all do these things that we think, what the heck, how embarrassing. And it becomes less embarrassing when you share it with people.
Right.
And then I got up and I gave my next talk and I confidently went forward. And I think that was a great litmus test for me to say that I'm becoming more comfortable in my imperfections and in the ways that I fail. And so that felt like a win to me, to sort of get back up on the horse right away and not to feel overwhelmed or ashamed over something that was merely a mistake. And it's okay. We can laugh with one another. I think we bond together when we learn of each other's
We
mistakes,
do.
even more so than probably our victories. So yeah, it was great to post on Instagram and just to feel like I could laugh. And I'm glad that it made you laugh. And I think it made other people laugh in both horror and, some sort of commiseration with me, because I don't think any of us would want that.
Of course not. And you're so right. We do bond in our vulnerability.
Mhm.
And I know I even looked at some of the posts and it's like, that's why I love you, Melissa. And women feel like, oh my gosh, she's real, and she's like me and she makes mistakes just like me.
Yes.
Despite the fact that you've written, this whole book and you are so very vulnerable in both of your books, it's still this aspect of seeing you as the real person. So love it.
Yeah, I think it's easy to think like, oh, she's an author and a speaker,
Mhm.
and you suddenly start to separate me from, your average ordinary life. And I'm like, oh, no, no. I think I have to remind myself, and I want to regularly remind other people, like, we're all on this journey together. This happens to be my wheelhouse to speak and write, but my goodness sakes, it's no different than anybody else's gifts and talents, in terms of, if we're bringing our best selves to the world, then we shine. And then we also make sure that people know that we're not perfect. And I'm a big believer in that, both for my own soul and for other people's.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, because I know that you are helping so many women. And today, as we talk, we are not going to heal or fix anyone's depression or
Mm.
their darkness, but we're going to talk about it. And I have to say that I have been practicing as a psychotherapist for, I always forget, like 5 years ago. I think I used to say 15 years ago. So I'm sure it's about 20 now or more. And this book helped me look at depression in a way I've never looked at it before.
Wow.
And that really says a lot, because I study this stuff. And even if it's not depression, because I want to talk, to women as they're listening, you're also talking about just a dark place, and we all have them. What I hope and my goal for this is that we can look at our darkness and our depression in a totally different way. And so I do encourage you to read this book, because that's really what it's all about. So I was really moved, and you talked about it in the first book, but the second book also, when you talked about wanting God to take away your depression,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that he could and that he doesn't. And so, of course, that's painful. And can you talk a little bit about that experience and what you've heard from God in that process?
Sure. I mean, it's never been a comfortable aspect of my life. It's never been something that I've wanted or, sort of just embraced or wrapped my arms around. But I've struggled with depression and anxiety on and off since I was about 13. It has little to do with the circumstances of my life. It comes and goes at will, and I can't really predict it. I mean, obviously, there are certain times in a person's life that you're more susceptible to depression when things are hard, but that hasn't always been the case for me. It's come in waves when everything is great. And so it didn't make sense to me that God allowed it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it made even less sense to me when I started speaking and writing and going into really, it was full-time ministry. I was working at a church, and I was like, God, I don't understand why I feel clear about my calling and I love what I do. And yet there were Sunday mornings where I was afraid to get out of the car in the morning because I felt so overwhelmed at the thought of talking to anyone or seeing anyone. And there were times where it was very difficult for me to get out of bed in the morning, to need to go into work or to need to face the day. And there were days where I didn't. I just ended up not going into work. It felt so incongruent with what I believed that God had for me that it really didn't make sense. And so I asked him a lot, and I talked to him a lot about asking him to take it away. And I tried to explain to him all the reasons that he should. And, there's this story in the Bible where the Apostle Paul talks to God, and he has this thorn in his side. He has this thing that he doesn't elaborate on what it is, but
Mm-hmm.
it's bothering him and it's crippling him in some ways. And he asks God to take it away several times. And he said that the Lord responded to him my grace is sufficient and my power is made perfect in your weakness. And I think I got to the point where I realized that that was basically what God was saying to me. And I was really disillusioned by that. And I grieved that for a long time because he basically said no to what I asked him for.
Mm-hmm.
But in that process, over the last, I would say, 8 years or so, I started to realize that if the God who loves me more than anyone, who is pleased with me and who has my back, if he has allowed it in my life, then perhaps there's a reason. And if he has allowed it to remain, then perhaps I don't have so much to be afraid of in facing the hard parts of depression and anxiety. And so it started to change my perspective. And that was where I started to think, well, how about we explore this instead of just trying to run from it? And that was where sort of the impetus of where the book came out of, is this exploration of difficult things rather than simply trying to get out of them or thinking they need to be removed in order for them to teach us anything.
Mm-hmm. But you did even more than exploring. You actually started looking at it, from a totally different point of view. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I love that you talk about that, because when we are in the darkest places in our lives, we can never see a purpose for it.
Yeah.
Ever.
And I think if we try and figure out a purpose for it too quickly, when we're in the midst of it, it cheapens the experience. It makes it more trite. If we are grieving, if we are struggling in a deep way, whether it's depression or grief or a divorce or even things like jealousy or feelings of failure, like all these things that start to move us into these hard places, if we try and figure out exactly what God is doing and exactly what it's all for while we're in the midst of it, I think we're rushing through something that is not yet ready to have perspective, because you can't have perspective when you're in it. You can only have perspective after you're through it. And so I think I really want to encourage people to slow down and that they don't need to figure out what it's all for quite yet. And I think other people very much want to be able to explain it to us as well, because they're uncomfortable with how uncomfortable we are. And so they're like, everything's for a purpose and you're going to learn great lessons and, you're so strong. And they say things like that, which are lovely and true, but they don't really hit the heart of just saying, I want to stay with you in this hard place. And sometimes there's not an explanation for the things that we go through. Sometimes there's just not an easy explanation for that. And I think to try and give easy explanations to complicated experiences in our lives dismisses the complexity and the heartache that we can feel in this lifetime.
I love that. And that's so true. And I'm so glad that you are telling women to sit in it. And I love the title of, I believe your first chapter is Welcome to Midnight, because I read that and I was like, wow, you're welcoming women, men, everybody who are reading this book to this place that they're in. And no one has probably ever thought of being welcome to it.
Yeah.
And that just sets the tone for really, I think, everything else in the book that you talk about. So if you're not going to try to figure it out, if you're not going to try to make it better, let's talk about how you welcome it.
Well, I literally can picture in my mind sitting in the darkness, like the darkness of a cave. If you've ever even explored actual caves, we were in the Oregon caves before, my family and I, a long time ago, we went and explored those. But if you've ever been in a physical place of darkness, you can't see anything around you, which makes you have to slow down, because if you run in the darkness, you fall and you scrape your knees and you run into stuff. And the other thing about darkness is that it can often be very quiet, which is scary. And so what I sort of imagine in my mind is that I'm sitting in the dark cave and I hear you walk in and I hear my sister or my brother groping around and being afraid and alone. And what I want to do is call out in the dark and say, I can hear you and you're not alone in this place. And let's just sit for a while until our eyes adjust. And maybe we can start to see our surroundings a bit more. But until that time, let's sit together and let's talk about the darkness a little bit. And when you become more comfortable with that, I think that's when your eyes start to adjust. And that's when you can start to get a sense of, okay, this place isn't as scary as I thought it was because I've slowed down and I've stopped and I've allowed it to be with me. And so that's kind of what the purpose of welcoming someone into midnight is to say, I'm here with you. I've been here and I've been here so often. It's become familiar territory to me. And I want it to become familiar territory to you, not because I want you to live there for the rest of your life, but because I'm pretty sure for most of us, we end up in dark places often enough where I want it to become familiar territory enough where you're not running into walls and scraping your knees and tripping over stuff, that you start to learn that there's a path to this that's actually good and okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of what I think of when I think of welcoming someone to midnight, is welcoming them to the dark place and to speak into their lives enough to say, you can slow down and you can stay here for a little bit and it's going to be okay.
Right. And that daylight is coming.
It is.
It's coming.
It always is.
And
always.
You talked about daylight work and midnight work, which I love too. And you talked about how they're both sacred. Well, you talked about midnight work being sacred and the fact that just like you don't want to waste your time, during the day, that you don't want to waste your midnight work. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So can you talk a little bit about daylight and midnight work?
Yeah, we all have our strengths. We all have the places in our lives where we really flourish. And daylight work to me is the work that we are called to do, that we are called to bring to this planet, and that we are called to speak into one another's lives. And so I think one of the things that I love about you is that you really encourage women to find their own place in the world in terms of, how you say like superpower, like Superwoman. You encourage them to find those things because everyone has those.
Yes.
And they're needed and they're important and they are sacred and they're good. And I think even if they're hard and even if we're not the best at it, we usually can tell if we're doing what it is we're meant to do, whether it's as simple as waking up in the morning and making your family breakfast, or it's running a corporation. The things that you bring out and put into this world that people benefit from is your daylight work. It's the work that's exterior. It's the work that actually probably is quantifiable in a lot of ways. You can see it. You can see the result of it. And it's usually something where we really flourish in our strengths. And, like I said, it doesn't have to be anything complicated. It can be just our daily lives. And then midnight work is the internal journey. It's the quieter places. It's the places of our weakness, of our undoneness. We are full people that are complex, and we have both the day and the night living in us. We have both our strengths and weaknesses living in us. I fear that in this world, we have a world that so readily wants to glorify the strengths and minimize the weaknesses. And I think it can damage our souls if we do that too much. I think we can end up feeling like our weaknesses are things to be ashamed of, or that they're not as valuable as our strengths. And I don't see it that way. I think they're equally important. And I actually think that one informs the other. And if you don't do your interior work, if you don't do the hard stuff of sort of exploring the dark places in your own mind and heart, I think your daylight work, I think the things that you bring out into this world will suffer. They won't be as rich and deep. And, you know this because the people who have been through amazingly horrifying, difficult things in their lives are usually the people who have a lot of wisdom to offer and usually a lot of humor too. Like they've got just great perspective. They're heroic to us, but it's not just because they have strength on its own. It's because they have strength that has been found in deep weakness. And I think we're inspired by people like that. It's just that we don't want to actually have to do that ourselves.
Right. We don't want to have to feel it. Nobody wants to walk through it. And nobody chooses to either. Nobody volunteers for that, right?
Oh my God. I say in my book, like, welcome to the club you never asked to join.
Exactly.
Like nobody wants to be there and nobody would choose it. I would not choose it. And I fully get that. And I'm completely with you. If you're out there going like, I don't want this. I'm like, I get it. I know. And yet I think, how devastating would it be if all the parts of my life that I didn't choose ended up being discarded, that they're not valuable? There's a huge difference between not choosing it and not valuing it.
I love that. I love that because just like you said, the darkness informs, I would say the darkness creates the strength.
Oh yeah.
It
I love
really
that.
does. It creates the strength.
I mean, it's like you think about planting a seed. The first place it goes is into the darkness, into the darkness of the soil. And it takes quite a bit of time before the outside world sees the work that's been going on in the darkness, And the same thing with all the important things with, a child, with having a child grow inside of you for 9 months. There's a lot of work that takes place that no one sees. But the beautiful results of that are things that are life-changing for both other people and for yourself and your own soul and your own journey.
I'm so glad you shared that because it's bothered me for a few weeks now. I was reading, it was some Christian blogger, and she was really kind of berating other Christian bloggers, women writers, for talking about all their failures. And she said that she felt that it was just glorifying their failures instead of, focusing on, God or their strength, or I'm not really sure what she wanted them to focus on actually. The first thing I thought was, I can't relate to you because yes, if you don't feel like you have any, or you feel like you shouldn't talk about them and you should only just talk about, edification and just wonderful, positive things, maybe there's a group of women out there that you can touch. But there's a whole nother group of women who aren't going to identify with you, but they will identify with the woman who's willing to talk about her struggles because they're there too. I mean, there's somebody for everybody, and that's wonderful. But I'm so glad that you're willing to talk about, the vulnerable parts.
Oh, good. I mean, I do think that we can rejoice in one another's victories.
Absolutely.
And I think they're inspiring, but I completely agree with you. I think we connect on a deeper level in our weaknesses and our failures, because those are the things that make us feel isolated. And our victories immediately make us feel connected to the world because it shores us up. It's edifying, it's encouraging, but our weaknesses usually bring about shame and insecurity, which isolates us. So when we find out that other people are struggling, then we realize, like, I'm not alone in this world.
Right.
And I think we constantly need to be reminded of that we're not alone in this world, because the world will start to try and convince you that you are. And I talk about it in the book because I know that there's a lot of people who immediately say, well, if I'm going to embrace and accept these dark places of my life, and I'm not going to immediately start fighting against them, then it means that I'm wallowing, that like I am in competition for Eeyore, and that I am like a miserable person. And I've met wallowers, and there are some people out there that are wallowers that they like are a total bummer to be around. And I don't want to be that person. And I was a little afraid that I was going to be kind of like put in this category of like, well, she writes about depression, so she's no fun. And I'm like, no, I'm super fun. Like, I like to go to parties, but I don't tend to find overall, I would say 9 out of 10 people don't wallow. I think they typically will say, I am going to fight this, and I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps, and I am not going to allow this into my life. And those are the people that this book is written for. It's for the people who are like, no, I don't want to do this. Because I don't think you're wallowing when you stop to explore and you slow down enough to say that maybe there's more to this darkness than simply trying to avoid it or get out of it. And it's not the same as wallowing. And you'll still be invited to parties, I promise, even if you get to explore the darkness.
Well, there is nothing wallowing about this book. In fact, the book gives you hope. And like I said, it gives you a totally different perspective. And what I do know about all kinds of psychological disorders and depression, of course, is that when we push things down and we try to not look at them, all we do is grow yucky, negative things that increase depression. It's when we're willing to open it up and look at it and examine things that we get it out of ourselves. So it's like purging, the toxin, and we can move towards health because we're also working on understanding ourselves better. So there's nothing bad about dissecting it and opening it up. It's just that most people want to just charge through it. And then just the perspective that you give someone as they're looking at it is just, it's so hopeful. So definitely nothing wallowing at all about that.
Well, thank you. And I have to say that the counselors and therapists in my life that I've had have been life-changing for me because, Zoe, and I'm confident that this is people's experience of you when they are in counseling with you, is I think we get so afraid of our feelings that we get afraid that they're going to overwhelm us and they're going to drown us. And when we have someone in a room with us and we can start to confess the things that most scare us and most undo us. And the person in the room doesn't run and isn't overwhelmed with us. It is a powerful thing. And I think that's why counseling and therapy can be so effective, because to have someone not be overwhelmed by the things that most overwhelm me teaches me that perhaps I won't drown in the worst parts of myself. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the work that is done by, people like you who can stay in the dark places with people enough for them to start to feel like perhaps they're not alone in this world. So I am a big fan of counseling and therapy and things like that, because I think it really taught me about God, because I was like, so if this imperfect person who's
I
sitting
love
in
that.
front of me can handle all the crazy that goes on inside my mind and they're not running from the room, then maybe God doesn't run either. And that it was my first indication of what grace looks like. And it's through people like you, that are not afraid of it. So I'm grateful. And I really do encourage, if someone is struggling deeply with depression, go get some counseling. Like, it's life changing and it is effective.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad you suggested that. And I love that you can talk about your experience, as a client with the therapist, so that people can really understand, because it's terrifying. And I've been in therapy myself, and it is terrifying and it's also, it's a social construct that's just not normal. There's no place ever in the world that you go, you see somebody you've never, met before or known, and you sit down and you tell them the stuff you wouldn't tell anybody else. So it's an odd social construct, and people are terrified, and it's a weird feeling. But when you do it, you will be amazed by the results of, just like you said, being able to share, and someone does sit with you in those places and help you work them through. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And I love that you said that you've gone into therapy yourself. Like,
Absolutely.
you've sat on both sides. I love that. So you can really empathize with people because you know what it's like to sit on that side of the room, to say, here I am and here's what I'm struggling with.
Absolutely. And it's a very vulnerable place, especially times that I've gone to therapy after I've been a therapist. I'm always like, okay, this is not where I want to be. I'm used to being in your chair, but it's a reality, and we have to work on ourselves, and it's a lifelong journey. So can you share just a couple of the gifts that you have gotten from your dark places?
Well, each chapter in the book explores a different kind of gift. And one of the early gifts is surrender, which so does not sound like a gift. It's like, what? But surrender is not the same as defeat. And I think we often think of surrender as sort of a war term where we raise the white flag and then, people just sort of trample over us and we have been defeated. But that's not the surrender I'm talking about. I'm talking about the surrender that says, I will let go of the things I thought I needed in my life. And there's tremendous grieving in that process. Surrender is not easy. But I really want to remind people, like, when I'm talking about the gift of surrender, you're not surrendering to your circumstances and you're not surrendering to people. Because oftentimes, we can get in some really hard places because of what someone else has done or not done in our lives. And they've wounded us deeply, or perhaps they've been hurtful, whatever it is. We're not surrendering to those people.
Excellent point.
I really call people and encourage people to surrender to God, because God is a safe place to go. And it can sort of be like, wait, what? But he's allowing these hard things. I know he's allowing the hard things, but he never allows them without careful consideration and ultimately an ability to stay with you in those hard places. And so to come to the end of yourself feels horrible. And then after that, it feels sort of like a relief because you're not carrying it anymore. You're not in charge of it anymore. And you don't have to fix this. There's a big difference between giving up and letting go. And when you let go of the things you thought your life should be, you can start to explore and enjoy the things your life is. And I think there's tremendous things in discovering those things. They just may be different than what you expected. So I really believe surrender is a really big gift.
That is beautiful.
Thank you. I mean, there's lots of gifts. There's silence, the gift of silence, which silence, again, like you can think of it as a punishment, the silent treatment. And yet silence can be so intimate. if you think about it, you're only silent with people that you're really comfortable with.
Oh,
You
great.
don't go into a
Yes.
room with, sort of acquaintances or strangers and just remain silent with them. People talk, they make small talk because they have to, because it's uncomfortable, because silence is intimate. But if you can sit, at the end of the day with your spouse or your best friend or whatever, and you guys can just sit in silence, it is a sign of deep connection. And so there's something to be enjoyed and said about, if you have a relationship with God where you can be silent and he can be silent with you and you don't think that that means he's punishing you, I think there's deep intimacy that can be found in that.
I love that. And I prescribe silence to almost all of my clients, and especially the ones who are dealing with, like you said, that feeling that emotions are going to overtake them and really essentially kill them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always prescribing silence. It's so important to be able to enjoy your own company, right? Because just like you
Yes.
enjoy the company of other people, you've
Mm-hmm.
got to be able to do that. So if you don't, and many people don't feel comfortable at all sitting in silence with themselves. They feel
Yeah.
horribly uncomfortable. Even sometimes when I prescribe it, I'll say 15 minutes and like, that's too much. Okay, let's
Oh
start
my
with
gosh.
5. Let's start with
People freak
3.
out. Yeah,
Yes.
I start with 3. And it's funny because some retreats that I lead, I lead the women in a time of silence, and I do it for 5 minutes. And I
Mhm.
promise them, I set my phone, I show them my phone. I'm like, I promise you, it's only 5 minutes. It's going to feel like 20 for some of you.
Right.
So it is a practice. I say that in my book. Like, this isn't something that it's like, oh, you just go and you're silent. Like, it's totally weird. Our brains do not function, what do they say? Nature abhors a vacuum. So
Mhm.
it's not a silence like a deadening of ourselves. It's an exploration, but it is quite vulnerable and it is scary because you don't know where you will go in that time of silence.
Mhm.
But I believe deeply that, just like you said, if you can't be comfortable in a room by yourself in silence, then you're asking other people to do something you can't do yourself. And
Mhm.
if you feel isolated from people or far away or misunderstood, perhaps the first step in feeling connected to other people is feeling connected to yourself.
Absolutely. And often what it is that we do keep ourselves so busy and we do distract ourselves so much because there are many things that we don't want to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're silent, we have no other choice but to look at them. But we need to. We need to. And then once
Mm-hmm.
we've looked at them and we realize that they are not the monsters that we thought or imagined subconsciously or otherwise that they were, then we can get to know ourselves and love
Yeah.
ourselves and enjoy ourselves.
One of the things that felt very important to me in writing this book is I wanted people to understand this isn't a, 7 steps to getting out of depression.
Right.
And so when we're talking about these things, Zoe, and I know this about you, like you and I are both in agreement, this is a process.
Hmm.
I'm not talking about like learning the lesson from silence, then moving on. I'm talking about for the rest of your life, learning from silence and sort of
Hmm.
allowing it to have a place in your life. And it will always be our instincts to get busy. I
Hmm.
mean, honestly, sometimes when I'm really overwhelmed, the first thing I do is clean my kitchen counter because it makes me feel like I've got control over something. Like I
Right.
have to get busy. And so we're not talking about things that it's like, okay, so do this and do that, and then you will be happy. Like, especially if you're in a hard place, having to do more is awful and
Mm.
feels awful and
Yes.
feels like, wait, I can't do more. And so I think a lot of the gifts of a dark place are the doing less. But to be comfortable with less means that there's wide open spaces, and wide open spaces can be scary. So I just want to invite people into the process of saying, I will just dip my toe in this. And if it means I will sit in silence for 2 minutes and set my phone for 2 minutes, and that's all I can do today, you did a good job because you're stepping in the right direction. This just isn't a quick fix. It's not, but it's a journey. And I believe that the things that come out of the dark places are the things that stay with us. And the more time and the more value we put toward the hard parts of our lives, I think the more fruit we show for it.
I love it. So much truth. So before we end, I just want to ask you, and you probably kind of already covered it, but how are you with your depression today?
Because I've had the opportunity to start to realize that it's not something I need to make excuses for,
Hmm.
it's not something that I need to get rid of. I now have room for it in my life. And it's so interesting because I've made room for it, which means, practically speaking, like if I'm having a really hard morning, then I will cancel appointments or I will not do as much as I had planned on doing.
Good for you.
I will allow myself to have a little extra space. And because I've started to do that, instead of saying, I need to get going, I need to get dressed, I need to do all this stuff, it's actually become a lot more manageable. Like it has its place in my life, but it doesn't take me under as often. I think a lot of it is just having acceptance to say, you know what? I like who I am. I like my life. And if this thing comes up every so often, I need to make room for it and not feel such shame about it. It's much like anybody who, if you're a diabetic, to pretend that you don't have diabetes is damaging.
Yes.
It will not help you in the long run. But if you pay attention to your sugar levels, if you pay attention to your insulin, if you pay attention to the things you're supposed to, you actually live a really fruitful life and it takes less of your time. And so when I pay attention to my depression, and I pay attention to it by making sure that I'm eating well, making sure that I'm exercising, that I have good people in my life that I can confess these things to, and to own it and to confess it. And I don't live in that space, but it's part of me and I'm not going to ignore it. And, I remember I had this woman who said, well, your depression is there, but it's not you.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciated her desire to want to sort of
Separate it.
make it so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. It's not the totality of who I am, but it has affected far too many areas of my life to pretend that it's not anything having to do with me. It is part of me, but it's not the whole of me. The whole of me, first and foremost, is that I'm a child of God and that He is immensely pleased and that there is peace between us. And there is no aspect of my character and my inabilities and weaknesses that He is horrified by or angry about or unaccepting of. And I think when we live accepting and actually embracing some of the harder aspects of our story, I think we live in a lot more freedom. So I still pay attention. I still go to counseling. I still make sure that I'm taking care of my body. And then I give myself room for the days that I have a hard time.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And as you said that about depression and how it is a part of you, it made me think of what I tell my daughter. And, my daughter has special needs and she will often describe herself as Prader-Willi syndrome, which is her disorder. And I always tell her, you are not Prader-Willi syndrome. You are Sullivan and you have Prader-Willi. And it is very much a part. I mean, it's a part of every cell in her body, but it's not who she is. But yes,
That's
we
right.
certainly
I
can.
love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it gives her autonomy from it.
Mm-hmm.
The soul of Sullivan cannot be pulled under by Prader-Willi.
Right.
It cannot overshadow the beautiful creation that she is created to be.
Mm-hmm.
It is a part of her, but it actually helps make the constellation of who she is even more beautiful in a lot of ways. But I think it takes a long time to get to. And I think you're helping her on the journey of acceptance, as we all have to be, with whatever it is that we have or don't have in our lives.
Yes, so true. And I could talk to you forever, but we are definitely running out of time. So thank you. Thank you. And please go check out her Instagram. It is both motivational, encouraging, inspirational, and really funny. It's funny because my assistant, I was having her put together the picture for our podcast and she got caught up in your Instagram. She's like, I love her. She's so funny. I said, I know. It was great. So please check out Melissa's Instagram, but more importantly, pre-order her book. It is Radiant Midnight and it comes out April 2nd. You can pre-order it on Amazon already, right?
Yes. And they can also order it from my website if they want me to sign it or anything like that.
Oh, yay. How can they what's your website?
My website is melissamamone.com. And I know my last name is hard to spell. So if you just look up the Radiant Midnight, then I'm sure you can find my website, but it's basically my first and last name.
And we'll put it on the show notes. So you should be able to find it and click on it. And thank you so much, Melissa. Best of luck. I hope this book is just as successful as all the other stuff you're doing. And thank you for just helping women heal.
Thank you as well, Zoe. I'm so glad to be in the world with you. And I'm so happy that we just have gotten to know each other and have found each other. It just is so inspiring to know that we're doing this really together. I mean, even though our paths are separate, we're doing this together, which is we're pouring into the lives of women to remind them that they're powerful and they're important and that they're pleasing, and in the fullness of all who they are and are not. And I love that. And that's what really makes, like you've said, the Superwoman. It is. It's all of it.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. We'll have you back for book number 3.
Yahoo! Okay. Thanks, Zoe, so much. Take care.
I hope that message encouraged you to honor your dark places, knowing that the daylight is coming. In interest of time, I'm not going to answer any questions for today. And just thank you. Thank you for tuning into the Dr. Zoe Show. New shows go up on Tuesdays. Subscribe so you don't miss a show. If you're interested in coaching or therapy, or you just want to get a little more help, go to my website at drzoeshaw.com or any of my social medias at the handle Dr. Zoe Shaw. Join my free newsletter by texting the word join to 38470. Reach out if you have any questions about Melissa. Please reach out to her. All links should be in the show notes. And I look forward to speaking with you wonderful ladies on social media throughout the week. Have a super week.
You've been listening to The Dr. Zoe Show, redefining your Superwoman, with your host, Dr. Zoe Shaw. Don't forget to sign up for her monthly newsletters to get encouragement, tips, and skills for keeping your mind in the Superwoman game. Connect with her now at www.drzoeshaw.com. Tell your friends and subscribe to her podcast on iTunes. Join us next time for another edition of The Dr. Zoe Show.